The victory in the arena changed everything overnight. Species that had dismissed humanity suddenly wanted to talk to them. Military academies requested that Jake come give lectures on tactics. The Galactic Patrol asked if he could train their officers. Ship manufacturers studied the recordings trying to understand how an outdated vessel had defeated modern technology. But not everyone was happy. The Krillix had been humiliated twice by the same human crew. Their pride would not allow them to let it stand. 2 weeks after the arena fight, a bounty appeared on the galactic networks. 1 million credits for Jake Morrison and his crew, dead or alive. The Krillix wanted revenge, and they were willing to pay for it. The Terran Coalition immediately offered to reassign the crew to a larger ship. They said Jake and his people had proven their point. They said humanity would not look weak if the Wasp's crew moved to a proper vessel with better weapons and defenses. They said the bounty made it too dangerous to keep flying in such a small ship. Jake called a crew meeting to discuss it. They gathered in the cramped mess hall that barely fit all 12 of them. He laid out the situation honestly. They had a target on their backs. Flying the Wasp meant they would always be at risk, but flying something bigger and stronger would mean giving up what made them special. Danny spoke first. He said he did not want a bigger ship. He had learned to fly in the Wasp. He knew every quirk and every capability. Starting over in a different vessel felt wrong. Lisa agreed. She had spent months optimizing every system. She knew the engines better than she knew her own heartbeat. Moving to a new ship meant losing all that knowledge. Carl said he could fire any weapon on any ship, but he liked the challenge of making limited firepower count. Helen said she had memorized navigation routes specifically designed for a small, fast vessel. Pete said the medical bay might be tiny, but he knew where everything was in the dark. Chris said he had finally gotten the communication systems working perfectly. Sophie was the last to speak. She looked at Jake and asked what he wanted. He admitted that he loved the Wasp. It was small and old and barely functional, but it was theirs. They had proven what it could do. Walking away felt like giving up. Sophie smiled and said that settled it. The crew would stay together and they would keep flying the smallest ship in the galaxy. The Terran Coalition was not happy with the decision, but they did not force the issue. Instead, they assigned the Wasp to missions that required speed and precision rather than firepower. The crew took on tasks that bigger ships could not handle. They rescued trapped miners from a collapsing asteroid. They stopped a smuggling operation in the Kepler sector. They negotiated peace between 2 colonies that had been fighting for decades. Each success added to their reputation. Other human crews began receiving their own ships, and they studied everything the Wasp had done. They learned from Jake's tactics. They adopted the philosophy that smaller could be better if you were smart about it. Humanity's position in the galactic community grew stronger with every victory. But the Krillix bounty remained active. Pirates and mercenaries watched for the Wasp wherever it went. Some tried to collect the reward. None succeeded. The crew had become experts at detecting threats and avoiding ambushes. When they could not avoid a fight, they won it quickly and decisively. 6 months after the arena fight, the Wasp received a distress call from an unexpected source. A galactic patrol cruiser had been disabled by pirates in the Outer Rim. The cruiser was one of the ships that had mocked the Wasp when humanity first joined the galactic fleet. Now it was helpless and calling for help. Jake could have ignored the call. No one would have blamed him. The patrol had never shown humans any respect. But that was not who Jake was. That was not who his crew was. They responded to the distress signal and found the cruiser surrounded by 5 pirate vessels. The pirates were salvaging valuable equipment and planned to leave the crew to die in space. The Wasp hit the pirates like a hammer. Danny flew patterns that the enemy could not track. Carl targeted their engines and weapons with surgical precision. Lisa kept the shield strong despite taking multiple hits. Within 20 minutes, 3 pirate ships were disabled and the other 2 had fled. The patrol cruiser captain sent a message of gratitude. His voice was humble. He said he had been wrong about humans. He said he had learned a valuable lesson about judging others by appearance. He said the galaxy was better for having Earth as part of it. Jake accepted the thanks, but he did not gloat. He knew that respect earned through actions was worth more than respect demanded through words. The Wasp towed the damaged cruiser to the nearest station and then continued on its patrol. The patrol captain made sure everyone heard what had happened. The story spread quickly. More missions followed. The Wasp broke up a slavery ring that had been operating for years. They stopped a terrorist attack on a civilian station. They found a lost colony ship that had been drifting for decades. Every success proved that humanity belonged among the stars. The Terran coalition gained a permanent seat on the Galactic Defense Council. Earth was no longer seen as a minor species that barely deserved attention. Humans were recognized as valuable members of the galactic community, and everyone knew it had started with 12 people in the smallest ship anyone had ever seen. Jake stood on the bridge one evening and looked at his crew. Sophie was reviewing reports at her station. Danny was practicing a new maneuver on the simulator. Lisa was in the engine room singing to the reactor like always. Carl was cleaning his weapons console. Helen was charting their next course. Pete was organizing the medical supplies. Chris was updating the communication systems. They had been offered promotions and transfers a dozen times. They had been offered command of larger ships and prestigious positions. Every single person had turned down every single offer. They wanted to stay together. They wanted to keep flying the Wasp. They had proven something that no one else had believed possible, and they were not done yet. Young officers sometimes visited the ship to meet the legendary crew. They asked how Jake had done it. They asked how 12 people in an outdated vessel had changed what the galaxy thought was possible. Jake always gave the same answer. He told them that humanity had always been good at surviving with less than they needed. Earth had been a hard world, and it had made humans adaptable and resourceful. When other species had overwhelming advantages, humans learned to be clever. When other species had better technology, humans learned to use tactics and strategy. When other species dismissed them, humans proved they were wrong. But more than that, Jake told the young officers that it was never about the ship. The Wasp was old and small and barely functional. What made it deadly was the crew. 12 people who trusted each other completely. 12 people who never gave up no matter how bad the odds looked. 12 people who understood that winning was not about having the biggest weapons or the strongest shields. It was about having the courage to face impossible odds and the intelligence to find a way through them. Jake kept the Wasp exactly as it was. He refused all offers to upgrade it to modern systems. When people asked why, he would tell them that the ship was a reminder. It was a reminder that size did not determine worth. It was a reminder that technology could be overcome by skill. It was a reminder that counting someone out was the fastest way to be proven wrong. The galaxy had learned that lesson the hard way. They had given humanity a ship meant to embarrass them. They had laughed at the idea that 12 people could matter in a universe of billions. They had assumed that humans would fail and prove they did not belong among the stars. Instead, the smallest ship in the galaxy had carried the deadliest crew to victory after victory. Jake Morrison and his team had shown that humans would never be dismissed again. They had proven that when humanity decided something needed to be done, no force in the universe could stop them from finding a way. The Wasp jumped to hyperspace, carrying its crew toward whatever challenge waited next. Behind them was a trail of victories and rescued lives and impossible odds overcome. Ahead was a galaxy that had finally learned to respect Earth. And on the bridge, Jake Morrison smiled because he knew this was only the beginning. Humanity had so much more to prove, and he could not wait to get started. The asteroid field had been dismissed by Kelthax as irrelevant background scenery. He had not planned to use it. He had not planned for his opponent to use it either. That was his first mistake. Jake had studied the terrain for 3 days. He knew every rock. He knew every gap. He knew exactly where he wanted the swift victory to follow him. Danny flew the Wasp into the asteroids at a speed that made half the crew grab their seats. The ship twisted and turned between rocks that seemed too close together for anything to pass through. The swift victory followed because Kelthax could not let his prey escape. His larger ship was not built for this kind of maneuvering. It had to slow down. It had to be more careful. The gap between the ships started to grow. Jake told Carl to fire at the asteroids, not at the enemy. Carl did not question the order. He trusted his captain. He fired their weapons at specific rocks that Jake had marked during their planning. The asteroids cracked and broke apart. Debris scattered in all directions. Some of it bounced off the Wasp's shields. Most of it created a cloud of dust and stone that made sensors useless. Kelthax lost visual contact with the Wasp. His sensors were confused by all the debris. He slowed his ship even more because flying blind through an asteroid field was suicide. That was exactly what Jake had wanted. The swift victory was powerful, but it was now operating in an environment where power did not matter as much as precision. Lisa called out from engineering that she was shutting down everything they did not need. Life support stayed on minimum. Lights went dark except for emergency strips. Every bit of power was channeled to shields and weapons and engines. The crew worked in dimness lit only by their control panels, but no one complained. They understood what she was doing. The Wasp emerged from the debris cloud at a different angle than where it had entered. Danny had used the cover to change direction. The swift victory was exactly where Helen had predicted it would be. Carl had 3 seconds to make his shot. He fired at the same point on the enemy's shields that he had been targeting since the engagement began. The simulation recorded the hit. The swift victory's shields flickered in that section. They did not fail, but they were weakened. Kelthax reacted faster than Jake had hoped. He ordered his ship to rotate and protect the damaged section. He also fired back, and his weapons were not small. The Wasp's shields absorbed the blast, but Lisa reported they had lost 40% of their defensive power from that single hit. Sophie ran calculations, and her voice was tight with stress. She said they could take maybe 2 more hits like that before their shields collapsed completely. After that, the simulation would register them as destroyed. They needed to stop getting hit. Jake agreed. He told Danny to make them impossible to target. What followed was the most intense flying that Danny had ever done. He used the asteroids like a playground. The Wasp dove under rocks and spun around them and scraped past them with meters to spare. Every time Kelthax thought he had a firing solution, the human ship was somewhere else. Every time the swift victory tried to predict their path, Danny changed it. But flying like that came with a cost. 3 crew members were injured by the extreme forces. Pete had to treat them while strapped into his own seat because there was no time to stop. They stayed at their posts with broken ribs and concussions, because leaving would mean the crew was short-handed. Jake saw their pain and felt guilt, but there was nothing he could do except win this fight. Carl kept firing at the weak point in the swift victory's shields. Each hit degraded them a little more. Each hit brought them closer to a breakthrough. But the shields were tough and designed to handle sustained fire. They were healing almost as fast as Carl could damage them. Helen was monitoring the pattern, and she suddenly called out that she saw something. The swift victory's defensive systems were rotating their shield strength to protect damaged areas. It was automatic and efficient, but it followed a pattern. Helen had watched it long enough to predict when the weakened section would rotate back into position. She told Carl exactly when to fire. She gave him a 3-second window. Carl waited. His hands were steady on the controls. The countdown reached 0 and he fired. The shot hit the weakened section at the exact moment when it was most vulnerable. The shields failed in that spot. The simulated weapon blast punched through and registered a hit on the swift victory's hull. The damage was minor, but it was there. First blood had been drawn. The watching crowd erupted in noise. No one could believe what they were seeing. The smallest ship in the galaxy had just damaged a modern cruiser. Kelthax's voice came over the communication channel. He was angry now. He said that luck would only carry the humans so far. He ordered his crew to maximum combat speed. The swift victory came at them with everything it had. Jake had been waiting for this. He had been waiting for Kelthax to let anger replace strategy. The Xanthari captain wanted to end this fight quickly now. He wanted to crush these upstart humans and restore his honor. That desire made him predictable. Jake told Sophie to execute Plan Gamma. She looked at him like he was insane. Plan Gamma was the one they had labeled as probably suicidal. Sophie hesitated for 2 seconds, and then she started calling out instructions. The crew responded instantly. Danny began a maneuver that would put them on a collision course with 2 massive asteroids. Lisa diverted all power from weapons to engines and shields. Carl prepared to fire at both asteroids simultaneously. Helen calculated the exact trajectory they needed. Chris made sure their communication systems were recording everything, because if this worked, everyone needed to see it. The Wasp accelerated toward a gap between 2 asteroids that was barely wider than the ship itself. The swift victory pursued them directly. Kelthax saw the gap. He saw what the humans were attempting. He thought they were trying to escape through terrain he could not follow. He was partially right. The Wasp could fit through that gap. His ship could not. But Jake was not trying to escape. Danny threaded the Wasp through the gap with centimeters to spare on both sides. The moment they were through, Carl fired at both asteroids. The rocks were already unstable from previous weapons fire. The shots made them shatter. Massive chunks of stone broke free and tumbled directly toward the swift Victory. Kelthax had three choices. He could reverse engines and try to stop, but his ship had too much momentum. He could try to shoot the asteroids, but there were too many pieces and they were too close. He could try to turn away, but that would expose his weakened shields to more damage. He chose to go forward and trust his shields to protect him. The asteroid debris slammed into the swift Victory from multiple angles. The shields held against most of it, but not all of it. Several large pieces hit the weakened section that Carl had been targeting. The shields failed completely in that area. Simulated damage registered across the cruiser's systems. The hit affected their engines and primary weapons and navigation. The monitoring computers recorded it all. The swift Victory was still in the fight, but it was hurt. Kelthax tried to rotate his ship to protect the damaged section, but his maneuvering systems were responding slowly. The Wasp circled back like a predator smelling blood. Carl targeted the exposed section and fired repeatedly. Each hit registered more damage. The simulation calculated the cumulative effect. The Senate observers watched their instruments in disbelief. The swift Victory's engines were reading as critically damaged. Life support was failing in 3 sections. Weapons were offline. According to the simulation parameters, the ship was defeated. The engagement was over. The smallest ship in the galaxy had won. Silence filled the arena. Thousands of beings stared at their displays, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Kelthax sat in his command chair looking like someone had hit him with a hammer. Kel stood in the Senate chamber with his mouth open. No one moved. No one spoke. Jake broke the silence. He transmitted a message to the swift Victory. He thanked Kelthax for an honorable fight. He said the Xanthari captain had been a worthy opponent. He said that humans had learned long ago that size was not everything. What mattered was how you used what you had. The crowd found its voice. Some species cheered. Others argued. Everyone had an opinion, but no one could deny what the recording showed. The Wasp had defeated the swift Victory in fair combat under monitored conditions. There could be no accusations of cheating or luck. The humans had proven themselves. The summons from the Galactic Senate arrived 4 days after the convoy rescue, and it was not the friendly kind of summons. Jake read the message 3 times to make sure he understood it correctly. The Senate wanted to question his crew about the incident with the Krillix raiders. Several species were calling the mission report inaccurate or impossible. The Krillix ambassador was demanding an investigation into whether humans had used illegal weapons or forbidden technology. Sophie said what everyone was thinking. The galaxy did not want to believe that humans could win. It was easier to accuse them of cheating than to admit they had been wrong about Earth. Jake agreed, but he also knew they had no choice. If they refused to appear before the Senate, it would look like guilt. If they appeared and could not defend themselves, it would destroy humanity's reputation before it even started. The trip to the Senate world took 6 days. The Wasp looked even smaller when they docked at the massive station orbiting the planet. Ships from 100 different species surrounded them, and every single one made their vessel look like a toy. The crew put on their dress uniforms, which were simple and practical, compared to the elaborate outfits worn by other species. Jake led them through corridors filled with aliens who stared at them with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. The Senate chamber was enormous. Representatives from thousands of worlds sat in curved rows that rose up toward a domed ceiling. At the center was a platform where those being questioned had to stand. Jake and his crew walked to that platform while every eye in the chamber watched them. The silence was heavy and judgmental. The Xanthari representative spoke first. His name was something unpronounceable, so everyone just called him Ambassador Kel. He was tall and thin with blue skin and 4 arms. He smiled as he addressed the chamber, but there was no warmth in it. He said that the human crew claimed to have defeated 4 Krillix raiders with a ship that was centuries old. He said this with the tone of someone pointing out an obvious lie. He suggested that perhaps the humans had misunderstood what happened. Perhaps the raiders had already been damaged. Perhaps they had fled for other reasons. Jake listened without expression. Kel was not trying to find the truth. He was trying to make humans look foolish. When Kel finished speaking, Jake asked if he could respond. The Senate chair gave permission. Jake kept his voice calm and professional as he walked through the battle step by step. He explained their tactics. He explained how they had used the convoy ships for cover. He explained how they had targeted specific systems instead of trying to overpower the raiders. Kel interrupted him. He said that tactics were all very interesting, but they did not change reality. A ship as small and outdated as the Wasp could not defeat 4 raiders no matter how clever the crew thought they were. It was simply not possible. Therefore, either the humans were lying or they had used technology that was not in their official inventory. The Krillix ambassador stood and demanded that the Wasp be inspected. He wanted every system examined. He wanted proof that humans had not modified their ship with stolen or illegal technology. Jake agreed immediately. He had nothing to hide. He invited the Senate to send inspectors whenever they wanted. The agreement caught Kel off guard. He had expected resistance. For 3 days, inspectors crawled over every centimeter of the Wasp. They checked the weapons. They checked the shields. They checked the engines and the reactor and every single system on the ship. They found exactly what Jake knew they would find. An old, outdated vessel with standard equipment that should not have been able to do what the humans claimed. The inspectors reported their findings with confusion in their voices. Kel was not satisfied. He stood before the Senate again and said that if the ship was not special, then perhaps the humans had been lucky. Perhaps they had faced incompetent raiders. Perhaps the battle had not happened the way they claimed. He said there was only one way to truly test whether humans deserved their place in the galactic community. He challenged Jake to prove his crew's abilities in the arena. The arena was a place where disputes between species were sometimes settled through combat. It was controlled and monitored. All weapons were set to simulation mode, so ships could fight without actually being destroyed. Kel proposed that the Wasp face a Zenthari patrol cruiser. If the humans won, then no one would question their abilities again. If they lost, then Earth would accept that they had been fortunate once and should not expect to be fortunate again. Sophie grabbed Jake's arm and whispered that it was a trap. The Zenthari cruiser would be 5 times larger than the Wasp. It would have modern weapons and shields and engines. It would have a full crew of trained warriors. Kel was setting them up to fail in front of the entire galaxy. Jake knew she was right. He also knew that refusing would be worse than losing. If they did not accept the challenge, humanity would be branded as cowards or frauds. Jake looked at his crew. Danny met his eyes and nodded. Lisa crossed her arms and looked determined. Carl cracked his knuckles. Helen was already calculating vectors in her head. Pete looked nervous but ready. Chris gave a thumbs up. Every single person was willing to face impossible odds again. Jake turned to Kel and accepted the challenge. The next 3 days were a blur of preparation. The crew ran simulations until they could barely see straight. They practiced maneuvers that pushed the ship to its limits. Lisa found ways to squeeze more power from systems that were already running at maximum. Carl memorized the firing patterns of Zenthari weapons. Helen plotted attack vectors that looked insane on paper. Pete made sure everyone was physically ready for the stress of high-speed combat. Chris worked on communication systems because coordination would be essential. Sophie organized everything and made sure nothing was overlooked. Danny spent hours in the pilot seat until the controls felt like extensions of his own hands. The day of the challenge arrived and the Senate chamber was packed. Additional viewing platforms had been set up for the thousands of beings who wanted to watch. The Wasp and the Zenthari cruiser were moved to the arena, which was a massive area of empty space surrounded by sensor arrays and monitoring equipment. The cruiser was named the Swift Victory, and it lived up to its name. It was sleek and powerful and modern in every way. The Zenthari captain was Kelthax, and he had fought in 30 successful campaigns. He broadcast a message before the engagement began. He said he respected the humans for accepting the challenge, but respect would not save them. He said the Swift Victory would demonstrate the difference between courage and capability. He said this would be educational for everyone watching. Jake sat in his captain's chair and felt surprisingly calm. His crew was ready. His ship was ready. They had practiced everything they could practice. Now it came down to execution. He looked at Sophie and she looked back at him. No words were needed. They had been through too much together. She knew what he was thinking and he knew she trusted him. The Senate observer gave the signal. The engagement began. The Swift Victory advanced with confidence. Its shields shimmered with power. Its weapons charged with energy that could cut through the Wasp in seconds. Kelthax was not rushing. He was being careful and professional. He clearly expected this to be over quickly. Danny took the Wasp backward like they were retreating. The watching crowd made sounds of disappointment. It looked like the humans were afraid. It looked like they realized they were outmatched. Kelthax increased speed to pursue them. His ship moved faster and the gap between them closed. Jake waited. He watched the distance decrease on his display. He watched the swift victory commit to its course. He waited until the exact right moment, and then he gave the order that would change everything. Danny's hands moved across the controls. The Wasp stopped retreating. Instead, it spun and accelerated directly toward the asteroid field that floated nearby. The real battle was about to begin, and the galaxy was about to learn that humans did not fight fair. They fought to win. 3 weeks in the Outer Rim had been quiet, and Jake was starting to worry that quiet was worse than action. The crew had fallen into routines. They ran drills every day. Lisa had managed to squeeze an extra 5% efficiency out of the reactor. Carl had memorized every quirk of their weapon systems, but routines and drills were not the same as real experience, and everyone knew it. The distress signal came through on a Tuesday morning, though time did not mean much in space. Helen picked it up first, and she called out that someone was in trouble. The signal was weak and breaking up, but the computer managed to decode it. A Valtorian trade convoy was under attack. 6 cargo ships were being raided, and they needed help immediately. Sophie pulled up the location and her face went pale. The convoy was 2 hours away at maximum speed. She ran the numbers and then ran them again like she was hoping for a different answer. 4 Krillix raider ships were attacking the convoy. Each raider was 10 times the size of the Wasp. Each one had weapons that could tear through their shields in seconds. Each one had more crew than the entire population of their ship. Jake asked Danny how fast they could get there. Danny said 2 hours if he pushed the engines past their safety limits. Jake told him to push them. He turned to Sophie and saw the question in her eyes before she asked it. She wanted to know what he thought 12 people in a tiny ship could do against 4 raiders that outgunned them in every possible way. The logical choice was obvious. They should call for backup from the Galactic Patrol and wait for proper ships to arrive. But backup was 6 hours away at minimum. The convoy would be destroyed or captured long before help arrived. The Valtorians would die or be taken as slaves. The raiders would escape with their prize. And the Wasp would have followed protocol while innocent people suffered. Jake looked at his crew. Every single person was watching him and waiting. Carl had his hands on the weapons controls ready to fire. Lisa was already rerouting power to prepare for combat. Danny was checking their course and calculating approach vectors. Pete was securing the medical bay for casualties. They were not asking if they should help. They were asking when they would start fighting. Sophie spoke again, and her voice was steady. She said the math did not work in their favor. She said they could not win this fight with conventional tactics. She said that running in with guns blazing would get them all killed in the first 30 seconds. Jake nodded because she was right about all of it. Then he asked her if she wanted to live forever. She stared at him for 3 seconds, and then she smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had just decided that dying for something was better than living for nothing. The Wasp raced through space faster than it was meant to go. The engine screamed and the hull shook, but Danny kept them on course. Jake called the crew together over the communication system, and he laid out his plan. It was insane and desperate, and it relied on the enemy doing exactly what he predicted. It also relied on every person doing their job perfectly with no mistakes and no second chances. The Krillix were known across the galaxy as brutal and efficient raiders. They attacked in groups. They overwhelmed their targets with superior firepower. They did not expect resistance because most ships ran from them. They definitely did not expect resistance from something as small as the Wasp. That overconfidence was going to be their weakness. They came out of faster than light speed, right on top of the battle. The convoy was trying to run, but the massive cargo ships were slow. The raiders circled them like predators playing with their food. Weapons fire lit up the space between the ships. One of the cargo vessels was already venting atmosphere from a dozen holes in its hull. Danny did not give the raiders time to react. He took the Wasp straight into the middle of the fight at full speed. The ship was so small that the raider sensors took 3 full seconds to even register them as a threat. By then, they were already past the first raider ship and using the convoy vessels as cover. The cargo ships were enormous compared to the Wasp. Danny flew between them and under them and around them so fast that the raiders could not get a clear shot. Their targeting systems were designed for big, slow targets, not for something that moved like an angry wasp. Jake had counted on that. Carl was not trying to destroy the raiders because that was impossible. Instead, he was targeting specific systems: communications arrays, sensor clusters, targeting computers. Every shot was carefully aimed at something that would hurt the raiders without needing to penetrate their heavy shields. Lisa fed him every bit of power she could spare, and Carl made every shot count. The first raider lost its main sensor array, and suddenly it was flying half-blind. The second lost its communication system and could not coordinate with the others. The third took damage to its targeting computer, and its weapons started firing in the wrong direction. The fourth tried to chase the wasp and nearly collided with one of the cargo ships it was supposed to be capturing. Jake watched his plan unfold, and he allowed himself a moment of hope. The raiders were confused and angry. They were used to easy prey that ran or surrendered. They were not used to something that fought back with precision and strategy. But confusion would only last so long. Eventually they would adapt. Eventually they would work together to corner the wasp. And when that happened, his crew would have to be ready. Helen called out a warning. 2 of the raiders were moving to flank them. They were learning. They were starting to predict where the wasp would go next. If they caught the ship in a crossfire, it would be over. Jake told Danny to do the thing they had practiced. The thing that everyone said was impossible. Danny grinned and his hands moved across the controls. The wasp spun in place while still moving forward, and the sudden change in orientation threw off the raiders' targeting. Then Danny fired the maneuvering thrusters in a sequence that should have torn the ship apart. Instead, it made them dance sideways through space like physics had taken a coffee break. Carl fired the moment they lined up with one of the raiders. His shot was not aimed at the hull. It was aimed at the exact point where he had already weakened the shields with 3 previous hits. The shields failed in that one spot, and the shot punched through. It hit the raider's engine cluster, and there was a beautiful explosion of light and gas. The damaged raider started spinning out of control. It crashed into another raider ship, and both vessels tangled together in a mess of metal and fire. The third raider took one look at what had happened and decided it wanted nothing to do with these crazy humans. It turned and ran. The fourth was still trying to restore its targeting systems when the Valtorian cargo ships finally got their own weapons online and opened fire. The battle was over. 4 raiders had been defeated or driven off by the smallest ship in the galaxy. The Wasp had not taken a single hit. The crew sat in shocked silence for a moment, and then Carl started laughing. It was the kind of laughter that came from surviving something you thought would kill you. Within seconds, everyone was laughing except Jake, who was trying to look professional, and Sophie, who was already writing the mission report that no one would believe. The Valtorian convoy captain sent them a message. His voice was shaking. He said he had never seen anything like that in 40 years of space travel. He asked what kind of ship they were flying. Jake told him it was the smallest one in the galaxy. The Valtorian captain was quiet for a long moment, and then he said that size clearly did not matter. Sophie finished the report and sent it to Terran Command. Jake knew what would happen next. The report would be forwarded to the Galactic Senate. The other species would read it and they would not believe it. They would think the humans were lying or exaggerating. They would demand proof, and Jake would give them all the proof they wanted. The Wasp set course for the nearest station to drop off the convoy and refuel. The crew was tired but satisfied. They had done something that should have been impossible. They had saved lives. They had proven that humans could fight and win even when everything was against them. Danny was already talking about the maneuvers he wanted to try next time. Lisa was planning upgrades to the engines. Carl was reviewing the battle footage to see what he could improve. Jake sat in his captain's chair and felt pride swell in his chest. His crew was extraordinary. His ship was terrible, and somehow together they had just changed what the galaxy thought was possible. Jake Morrison had seen better days, and he had definitely seen better ships. He stood on the bridge of the CSS Wasp and tried not to let his disappointment show on his face. The ship was tiny compared to everything else floating in the docking bay around them. It looked like someone had taken a proper warship and cut away everything except the absolute essentials. The metal hull was old and scarred from decades of use by whoever owned it before. The control panels flickered with lights that seemed uncertain about whether they wanted to stay on or give up completely. This was humanity's first official military vessel in the galactic fleet, and it was barely larger than a shuttle. Sophie Grant stood beside him with her arms crossed and her jaw tight. She had been his second in command for 5 years back on Earth, and she had followed him into this assignment without question. Now she was probably questioning that decision. She looked at the cramped bridge and then at Jake, and she did not need to say anything. Her eyes said it all. They had been given a ship that the galaxy considered garbage. The Galactic Senate had accepted humanity into their ranks 3 months ago, after decades of Earth trying to join the interstellar community. It should have been a moment of pride and celebration. Instead, it came with conditions that made it clear what the other species thought of humans. Earth would be allowed to have a defense force, but they would not be given new ships. They would not be given proper weapons. They would take what the other species no longer wanted, and they would be grateful for it. The Wasp had belonged to the Xanthari before it belonged to Earth. The Xanthari were a species that loved to remind everyone how advanced and superior they were. They had used this ship as a scout vessel 300 years ago, before replacing it with something better. Then they had stored it in a warehouse and forgotten about it. When humanity asked for ships, the Xanthari had smiled and offered this ancient piece of history. The other species in the Senate had laughed. The message was clear. Humans were not welcome as equals. They were being tolerated and nothing more. Jake walked across the bridge and ran his hand along one of the consoles. The metal was cold and smooth under his fingers. 12 crew members would serve on this ship. 12 people to run every system and fight every battle. Most alien vessels had crews in the hundreds. Some had thousands. But humans would make do with 12 because that was all the Wasp could hold. Danny Fletcher was already in the pilot seat testing the controls. He was young and eager, and he had been the best pilot in the Terran Coalition fleet. He could fly anything with engines, and he seemed excited rather than discouraged by the challenge. His fingers moved over the control board like he was playing a musical instrument. He called out that the maneuvering thrusters were responding, but they were slow. Everything on this ship was slow compared to modern vessels. Lisa Hayes emerged from the engine room with grease on her hands and determination on her face. She was the chief engineer, and if anyone could keep this ancient ship running, it would be her. She had spent the last 3 days taking apart every system and learning how it worked. She reported that the reactor was stable, but it produced about 30% of the power that a modern ship would have. The shields were functional but weak. The weapons were outdated and limited. She said all of this without emotion, like she was reading a grocery list. Then she smiled and said she had worked with worse. The rest of the crew filtered onto the bridge over the next hour. Carl Jensen took his position at the weapon station and immediately started cataloging what they had to work with. Helen Price sat down at navigation and began plotting courses through nearby space. Pete Sullivan checked the medical bay, which was barely large enough to be called a closet. Chris Logan started working on the communication systems, which kept cutting out every few minutes. They were all volunteers. Every single person on this ship had chosen to be here. Jake had been honest with them about what they were getting into. He had told them that the galaxy saw them as a joke. He had told them that they would be given the worst assignments and no respect. He had told them they might not survive their first real combat. And every single one of them had signed up anyway. Sophie moved to stand beside Jake, and she spoke quietly so only he could hear. She asked him if he really thought they could do this. She asked if 12 people in an outdated ship could prove anything to species that had been traveling the stars for thousands of years. Jake looked at his crew. He looked at Danny grinning at the pilot controls. He looked at Lisa wiping grease from her hands and getting ready to dive back into the engine room. He looked at Carl studying weapons that were older than anyone on the ship. Jake told Sophie that humans had always been good at one thing. They were good at surviving when they should not. They were good at winning when they should not. They were good at taking whatever they had and making it enough. The aliens had given them this ship because they thought it would fail. They thought humanity would embarrass itself and prove that Earth did not belong among the stars. But those aliens did not understand what humans were capable of when everyone counted them out. Their orders came through that evening. The Wasp was assigned to patrol the outer rim. It was the edge of explored space where pirates and raiders operated freely. The Galactic Patrol rarely went there because it was dangerous and unrewarding. It was exactly the kind of assignment you gave to someone you wanted to forget about. Jake read the orders aloud to his crew and nobody complained. They had expected this. The Wasp undocked from the station the next morning. Jake sat in the captain's chair, which was worn and uncomfortable. Sophie stood at her station reviewing system reports. Danny's hands were already moving across the pilot controls with growing confidence. The small ship pulled away from the massive station and pointed its nose toward the dark. As they moved away from the station, Jake thought about all the species watching them go. He thought about the Zenthari who had sold them this ship with smiles on their faces. He thought about the Senate delegates who had laughed during the transfer ceremony. He thought about every alien who had looked at humanity and decided they were not worth respect. The Wasp jumped to faster-than-light speed and the station disappeared behind them. The crew settled into their duties with quiet professionalism. They had a lot to prove and they had very little to prove it with. But they were human and that meant they would find a way. The galaxy was about to learn that the size of the ship did not matter nearly as much as the quality of the people inside it. Jake Morrison smiled to himself as the stars streaked past. Let them laugh now. Let them dismiss the smallest ship in the galaxy. They would not be laughing for long.